This is the real account of Dick Winters, the legendary commander of Easy Company, the very same men immortalized as the Band of Brothers. But beyond the TV series and popular legend lies Winters' own voice, drawn straight from his personal memoirs and recollections. These aren't just battlefield snapshots, they are a vivid, intimate window into the mind of a man who led ordinary citizen soldiers through some of the fiercest fighting of World War II. I can still feel the faint tremor of the engines beneath my boots as we sat waiting on that English airstrip. It was just after 2300 hours on the night of June 5th, and everything seemed unnaturally calm. Then, right on schedule, 2313, the props roared to life in sequence down the field, a chorus of mechanical thunder. The vibration traveled through the steel floor, up my legs, and into my chest. In that moment, it struck me fully that this was it. We were off to fight the greatest invasion ever attempted, carried by men and machines into the heart of Nazi-occupied France. I was on plane number 67, acting as jump master, with 17 men from the 1st Squad of 1st Platoon packed tight beside me. Lieutenant Salmons was our pilot, calm and professional, checking his instruments in the dim red glow of the cockpit. Ahead in plane number 66 was Easy Company's headquarters element, Lieutenant Meehan, 1st Sergeant Evans, and the rest of the company leadership crammed in with their gear. They didn't know they were flying into eternity. We lifted off from Up Pottery's darkened runway and climbed out, banking into a slow assembly over England. Our pilots leveled us at 1,500 feet, holding a wide circle until the entire formation of hundreds of C-47s was stitched together in the night sky. Finally, at 11:42 hours, we banked onto our heading, leaving the coast of England behind and joining the great airborne armada converging over the channel. It was a river of engines and silver shapes, wingtip to wingtip, running south under a pale moon. Salmon soon brought us down to 1,000 feet, then even lower, 500, trying to stay under German radar as we neared the French coast. I ran a mental checklist of everything I'd been trained for, but the knowledge that we were about to leap straight into Hitler's fortress Europe was like a stone in my gut. Optimal drop altitude was around 600 feet at 100 to 120 knots. It was supposed to be just high enough for our chutes to open, but low enough to keep us from hanging like piñatas for flak gunners. In training, that always sounded so clinical. Now it felt like a wager with God. About 20 minutes out, Lieutenant Salmons twisted back to shout something. Then the crew chief moved to the door and heaved it open. A freezing blast poured in, carrying the heavy scent of oil and salt. I stood up, pulling my static line taut, and stepped to the door. Outside, the sky was alive. For as far as I could see, aircraft filled the night in vast V of V formations, each wing loaded with paratroopers like us. It was the most breathtaking sight I'd ever laid eyes on. Rows and rows of C-47s spread across the heavens like a steel armada, each carrying men who would either help liberate Europe or die trying. Then, rolling inland over the French coast, we hit a bank of cloud so thick the formations vanished. Only faint blue formation lights ran along the wings, ghostly markers in the murk. Pilots had to keep dark to avoid night fighters. Most of these boys had a few hundred hours of flying at best, and this was their first taste of combat. I knew that above us was Colonel Charles Young, commander of the entire 439th Troop Carrier Group, a veteran attack pilot with years of low-altitude experience. But for the rest, this was a trial by fire. They were guiding these great herds of men and steel purely by instinct, hoping not to collide. Minutes later, the sky exploded, tracers lit up in red, blue, green, stitching the dark like angry fireworks. At first it seemed almost beautiful, until I realized every streak was trying to kill us. Lieutenant Bob Brewer, who ran our battalion's mortar platoon, would later say he'd never seen so much anti-aircraft fire in his life. Off to our right, I watched helplessly as Capelito's plane took hits. Tracers punched straight through the fuselage and sparked out the top, chewing up metal and spraying fragments. Capeluto kicked on the green light early, desperate to keep control. Through brief gaps in the cloud, I glimpsed that doomed plane clawing along. Later, I'd learn it kept flying for another minute, then did a slow, sickly wing over, landing lights flashing on as if trying to find a field. It didn't matter. It clipped a hedgerow and erupted into a rolling ball of flame. Everyone inside, Meehan, Evans, most of Easy's headquarters, gone in an instant. I didn't know it yet, but that moment made me Easy Company's commander. Back in our aircraft, Salmons throttled hard, dodging the worst of the fire. I was still at the door, head low, heart racing so violently it felt like it might burst. This was the first time I'd truly been under fire. We thought the Germans were misjudging our speed at first, leading us too far. But then their gunners corrected. The cracks of passing shells came sharper, then sharper still, until one hammering blow shook our tail. I locked eyes on the light panel, knuckles white on the doorframe. Then the green light blazed. I bellowed, "Go!" just as a fresh burst of 20mm slammed through the fuselage behind me, and I hurled myself out into nothing. I screamed, "Bill Lee," as the wind tore the words from my throat. The slipstream slammed me so hard my leg bag ripped away, taking most of my grenades and kit. My body was a ragdoll, tumbling, until my chute jerked me upright with such violence I thought my spine snapped. Somewhere behind me, PFC Bert Christensen came spinning out, clutching one of Easy's machine guns. Then Jeter Leonard, Joe Hogan, Christensen's gunner Robbins, and the rest. Luck is a cruel god, because plane number 66 was overloaded. Bob Smith and Red Hogan had been bumped to our aircraft at the last moment. That fluke saved their lives. The last man out was Bull Randleman, our pushman, a giant whose only job was to shove out anyone with second thoughts. Not that anyone needed it tonight. Down below, it was chaos. Our after-action reports later showed how bad it was. Only 10 out of 81 planes dropped on target. The rest were scattered like chaff across the Norman countryside. Some planes missed by 20 miles. Easy Company was flung several miles west of our objective. Ironically, intelligence would later reveal our planned DZ had been surrounded by dug-in rifle pits and machine guns. If we'd landed there in neat parade ground rows, it might have been a massacre. Our accidental chaos probably spared hundreds. I crashed into the earth at the edge of a field, jolting so hard it felt like my bones rattled. This was the only jump in my life that left me black and blue for a week. As I lay gasping, I could hear a church bell tolling from Saint-Mère-Église, calling villagers to fight a fire on the town's edge. Above, somewhere, a machine gun rattled, searching for drifting troopers. Worse, I was unarmed. My M1 and grenades had vanished with my leg bag. Just me, a helmet, and a boot knife. But I wasn't scared. I can't tell you why. Maybe it was training. Maybe the mind just clears when death is so close. Either way, fear would have killed us faster than any German. I pulled my knife, crouched low, and crept off. Not far away, another chute blossomed and dumped a paratrooper hard into the dirt. I cut him free, snatched a grenade off his harness, and said, "Let's go find my equipment." He had a Tommy gun, but looked reluctant. "Follow me," I told him. I led off toward where I hoped my leg bag might have fallen, until we got too close to a road where another machine gun was probing. "The hell with it," I muttered. We veered north, away from the guns, trying to regroup. A few minutes later I cricketed and got an answering click. It was Staff Sergeant Carwood Lipton. He had about a dozen men with him, and they'd found a signpost reading Sainte-Mère-Église. I pulled out my map, traced a line, realized just how badly off course we were. With that figured, I looked back at the flight path of the planes and picked the fastest way toward Utah Beach. Together, our combined group of around 12 set off, wading through hedgerows and shadowed lanes. Before long, we merged into a larger knot, about 50 men from the 502nd, with a colonel leading them, safety in numbers. I tucked us into their formation. The night was long, punctuated by heart-hammering encounters. At one point we stumbled on 4 horse-drawn German wagons, likely hauling gear for the Russian cavalry units rumoured to be in the area. We lit up 2 wagons, dropped several startled Germans, and watched the rest flee into the dark. Later, we found another shattered wagon. Dead Germans sprawled nearby. Under the seat, I found an M1. The weight of it in my hands was the best comfort I'd felt all night. By the time we marched on, I'd picked up a revolver, a belt, a canteen, and plenty of ammo. I was a soldier again. We pressed forward until first light, moving cautiously, ears straining for any sign of the enemy. Around 0600, we ran into Captain Jerry Gross of Dog Company, who had 40 men with him. We combined forces and kept pushing south toward our objective behind Utah. Minutes later, we stumbled right into our battalion staff. Incredibly, despite the scatter, Colonel Strayer had pulled together over 200 men, thanks in large part to Captain Hester. Hester had landed early, realized his stick was spread across 1,000 yards, and set amber lights in a tree to guide men in. Within an hour, he had a small army. Nixon scouted the nearest village, confirmed their location, and by 03:30, Strayer had assumed command. Easy Company was a shadow of itself, just 9 riflemen and 2 officers, me and Compton, with 2 light machine guns, 1 bazooka without ammo, and a mortar missing its base plate. No word from me, and that made me Easy Company's commander by default. We moved out. The sun climbed. In a village called Le Grand Chemin, heavy artillery rounds started crashing in, forcing the whole column to ground. After a short wait, Lieutenant Lavenson came striding down the line, looking for me. "Winters," he called. "They want you and your company up front." So off I went, not sure what awaited us. Up ahead, under the thin cover of trees, I found Hester, Nixon, and Lieutenant Kelly from Dog Company crouched over a rough plan. Kelly had already probed ahead with his platoon, found the German artillery, 4 105s dug in along a hedgerow covered by machine guns, firing directly down Causeway No. 2 at Utah Beach. Our bombers had missed them. That meant it fell to us. Hester turned to me and said simply, "There's fire along that hedgerow there. Take care of it." That was my entire order. No sand tables, no air recon, just that. I pulled my men together, had them drop everything but ammo and grenades. Then I crawled up a hedgerow to take a look for myself. The guns were emplaced in trenches, with machine guns scanning the fields. A frontal assault would be a bloodbath. But if we could slip down the flank, get close, hit 1 gun at a time, we might just do it. So that's what we did. My heart was pounding, my breath shallow. I knew the only way this would work was to move fast and keep our wits. As we crawled and scrambled, the rich Norman earth clinging to our knees and elbows, I felt strangely alive. This was everything we'd trained for distilled into one savage moment. Our tactics, our discipline, our courage tested against the guns of the Third Reich. When I got back to our small knot of men after my reconnaissance, I pulled them close and laid out the plan. Every man had a role. First, I set up one of our 2 machine guns behind a hedge where it could lay down a base of covering fire as we moved up. I told the gunner, "Don't fire unless you see a definite target. No sense giving away your position with blind bursts." Then I divided our little force into 2 teams, one under Lieutenant Buck Compton, the other with me. Compton took Sergeants Guarner and Malarkey and started working their way down a hedgerow to close on the first German gun. Meanwhile, I led Joe Toy, Popeye Wynn, and Gerald Lorraine, who had joined us from Regimental HQ, down a parallel hedge. Compton also sent Lipton and Ranney off to another concealed spot to put flanking fire on the enemy. Once they were in place, my small group crawled into an exposed field, bellies low, hearts pounding. When we hit the next hedge, I positioned our second machine gun there, aimed right at the first 105 that was firing down Causeway No. 2 toward Utah Beach. I repeated the same order, wait for a sure target. Then we crept on. The field felt a mile wide. We could hear Germans shouting, the occasional rattle of small arms. At Compton's hedge, I spotted a helmet poking up, so I fired 2 quick rounds. Later I found a splash of blood there, but no Jerry, probably dragged off. Next, I sent Compton and 2 men creeping along the hedge to lob grenades into the gun position. The rest of us covered them, spraying short bursts or popping off aimed shots. I remember feeding rounds into my M1, pausing only to slap in fresh clips. It took Compton longer to get set than I liked. We burned through too much ammo, but the important thing was the Germans hadn't pinned us with return fire. Finally, Compton was ready. Just as he raised his arm to hurl the grenades, I gave the signal and surged forward with the rest of the team. As their grenades went off, we charged together, yelling like devils, hurling our own grenades at the next gun pit. It was chaos, bullets cracking, German voices shouting. Then small arms fire slammed back at us, and grenades sailed overhead. Somewhere in that sprint, Popeye Wynne took a round right in the backside and tumbled into the trench. I'll never forget it. Rather than cry out or complain, he clutched his rifle and looked up at me, apologizing. "I'm sorry, Lieutenant, I goofed, I'm sorry." My God. Here was a man bleeding into the dirt of Normandy on D-Day, behind German lines, more upset that he might have let his buddies down than worried for himself. That kind of spirit, that was easy company. Suddenly a potato masher came spinning in and dropped right between Joe Toy's legs as he lay face down. I yelled at him, "Move, for Christ's sake, move!" But he just flinched. The grenade went off with a brutal thump. Toye bounced, but somehow, by sheer blind luck, was unhurt. A couple more men lobbed grenades into the gun position, and we rushed them outright. I didn't even spare a glance at Wynne. There was no time. Gerald, Lorraine, and Guarnera were at my side with their Tommy guns. I had my M1, and we dove straight in. 3 Germans bolted from the gun emplacement, running for Brecourt manor. I barely had to shout. Lorraine cut down one with a short burst. I aimed and dropped another with a shot to the head. The third spun back toward the gun pit. Guarnere missed his first burst, but I drilled the man through the spine, and then Guarnere walked up and finished him with a savage burst. No sooner had we dispatched them than a 4th German broke from the tree line about 100 yards off. I flopped prone, drew a bead, and squeezed the trigger. He dropped clean. It had taken all of maybe 20 seconds since we'd hit the trench. Expecting a counterattack, I hugged the ground and peered down the trench toward the next gun. Sure enough, 2 Germans were fumbling with a machine gun. I fired twice, the first round catching one in the hip. The next soldier took a slug through the shoulder. Toy and Compton got into position and laid down covering fire while I moved back to check on Wynne. He was still trying to apologize, worried he'd goofed off. I clapped him on the shoulder, told him to crawl back toward battalion on his own. No way could I spare a man to help him. When I returned, Compton was fiddling with a grenade. Suddenly he shouted, "Look out!" and we all dove flat. The grenade burst right there in the trench, but somehow, by miracle, nobody was hit. Just then, a terrified Jerry came stumbling toward us with his hands on his head. We had no one to escort him back, so one of the boys cracked him with brass knuckles. He lay moaning for half an hour. Moments later, 3 Germans appeared on the far side of the hedge, strolling casually with their mess kits swinging. Machine gunners, no doubt protecting the rear. I got 2 riflemen on line, told them to sight in at 200 yards. Someone must have shouted because the Germans stopped, heads cocked. That's when I gave the order. We opened fire and cut them down. It was time to hit the second gun. I left 3 men at the first position to lay supporting fire and led the rest forward. Machine gun fire across the field had slackened, almost as if the Germans didn't know what to do. Trusting that instinct, we charged, hurling grenades, screaming, pouring fire. In seconds, we overran the next position. No one on our side was hit this time, though we found the 2 wounded Jerrys I'd shot earlier, now captured. We were stretched dangerously thin. Our ammo was running low, and the machine gun section I'd requested hadn't arrived. I sent a runner back to battalion for reinforcements and more belts. That gut feeling that had helped us take the second howitzer also shaped my plan for the third gun. After a tense half hour, machine gunners finally appeared. I set them in place. 2 men from another outfit joined us too. One was Private Hall from a company. We surged at the third position in a violent, compact rush. Hall was killed outright, shot through as we advanced, but we smashed into the emplacement, killing or capturing the crew. 6 Germans came up the trench, with their hands over their heads, pleading, "No make me dead." I sent them back to battalion with a couple troopers, and immediately requested more ammunition and men. That's when I spotted Captain Hester coming forward through the orchard. He gave me 3 blocks of TNT and an incendiary grenade. I handed them off to be placed in the first 3 guns, along with instructions to wreck the radio equipment, range finders, and anything else the Germans might reuse. In the second gun pit, we found a treasure, a detailed map showing every 105mm position and machine gun nest across the Carentan. I sent it racing back to battalion. Nearby, we found belts of machine gun ammo loaded with wooden bullets, maybe a sign the Germans were running short, though it didn't much matter to us. Soon, Lieutenant Spears arrived from Dog Company with 5 men. He and Wild Bill Guarnere, who'd just learned his brother had been killed in Italy, led the assault on the final gun. Guarnere fought like a demon possessed. They stormed the position, taking more prisoners and knocking out the last piece. In the assault, Rusty Houch was killed by a shot to the head while raising up to throw a grenade, and Leonard Hicks was wounded. With all 4 guns destroyed, we began to pull back. Machine gun fire still lanced out from Brecourt Manor itself, forcing us to stay low. I ordered our own machine gunners out first, then the riflemen, covering the withdrawal. I was the last man to leave. As I moved down the trench for a final check, I spotted a wounded German trying to set up an MG. I put a bullet through his head. On the way back, we found Warrant Officer Hill. He'd been killed coming up to help us. In all, we lost 4 men dead, 6 wounded. We counted 15 German dead and took 12 prisoners. The rest of the force in that sector had been roughly 50 strong. From the time Hester pointed at the hedgerow and said, "Take care of it," only 3 hours had passed. Even though Easy Company was still scattered across Normandy, that little handful at Brecourt showed exactly what American airborne troops could do, outnumbered behind enemy lines, improvising under fire. Once the bullets started flying, our discipline and long months of training overcame any fear. We made mistakes, sure. Sometimes we charged blind through hedgerows, sometimes we exposed ourselves too long. But surprise, audacity, and sheer guts carried the day. Lipton later called it a unique example of a small, well-led assault force routing a much larger prepared position. Malarkey, who ran our 60mm mortar, said taking out those guns undoubtedly saved countless lives on Utah Beach. Lipton would later give me far too much credit, calling it the finest example he'd ever seen of a combat leader reading the field, forming a plan, inspiring men to each carry their part, and leading from the front. But the truth is, it wasn't my leadership, it was Easy Company. Their courage, their willingness to close with the enemy, that's what took Brecourt. For their actions, Compton, Guarnere, and Lorraine each received the Silver Star. Toy, Lipton, Malarkey, Ranney, Liebgott, Hendricks, Plesher, Petty, and even poor Popeye Wynne all earned Bronze Stars. I was proudest of that. Every man who fought that day was recognized. Later, General Omar Bradley would pin the Distinguished Service Cross on me for it. Years afterward, a letter found me from a junior officer who'd come up Utah on the very causeway our guns had been shelling. He was a medical officer who, on landing, found Captain John Ahern of the 70th Tank Battalion, both legs mangled by mines. That medic walked straight into the minefield, threw Ahern across his shoulders, and carried him to safety. Decades later, he wrote me to say he'd always wondered why the shelling on the causeway had suddenly stopped that morning. He thanked us, said he doubted he'd have made it off the beach otherwise. That medic was Elliot Richardson, later Attorney General under Nixon and recipient of the Presidential Medal of Freedom, and that, to me, was always the real measure of Brecourt. Not medals or citations, but the silent lives spared on that narrow stretch of Normandy road by a handful of tired, determined paratroopers who simply refused to fail. Another man who later told me just how much that day mattered was Sergeant H.G. Nerhood, a platoon sergeant in the 4th Infantry Division. He'd landed in the 2nd Assault Wave on Utah Beach. Each time he tried to push his men inland, artillery came crashing right down on top of them. His platoon leader was convinced there had to be a German forward observer somewhere calling down those murderous barrages. They searched the fields with desperate eyes, hoping to catch sight of the man directing their doom, but found nothing. Nerhood told it plain. "I just wanted to get the hell out of there." Then another barrage screamed in and tore through them. His platoon leader fell, and Nerhood hollered for a medic before waving the rest of the platoon forward. They sprinted about 30 yards, hearts pounding, only to have the shelling find them again. 5 more of his boys went down in twisted heaps. When a final shell burst so close it seemed to lift the earth itself under Nerhood's chest, the ground quaking beneath him, he waited for the next strike, but it didn't come. Slowly the shelling slackened, and his men could finally begin pushing inland. Later that day, their operations officer found them and said it was our paratroopers, who had knocked out the guns that had been hammering them. Nerhood rarely spoke of the war in the years that followed, but decades later, his grandson pressed him again and again to share the memories. Eventually he did, and his grandson recorded it and wrote to me in 2005. He said, "My grandfather was on that beach getting his butt kicked. Your men were at the guns, kicking butt and saving his, along with hundreds more. Had you not succeeded, I might not be alive this day to tell you how deeply grateful I am that Easy Company accomplished its mission." Nerhood and Elliot Richardson were just 2 men among many who survived Utah Beach that morning because Easy Company had done its bloody work at Brecourt. When we finally pulled off the field in front of Brecourt Manor, I accepted my first shot of hard cider. I was parched to the bone, my throat raw, and when one of the boys offered the bottle, I shocked them by taking it. I half expected it would slow my thoughts or dull my reflexes. It didn't. The cider burned its way down, a small mercy in a violent morning. Soon after, Lieutenants Harry Welsh and Warren Rausch arrived down the road with about 30 more troopers. I wasted no time. I broke them into 2 fresh platoons and had them stand by. I knew tanks were coming up from the beach, and when they arrived, rumbling through the hedgerows with Lewis Nixon perched alongside, I climbed aboard the lead Sherman and pointed out the German machine gun nests and the manor house itself. The tankers wasted no time. They swept those hedgerows and stone walls with their 50s and 30s, stitching every shadow with heavy fire. Armed with that kind of brute force, they silenced the last enemy resistance in minutes. By mid-afternoon, Brecourt was firmly ours. German forces had begun a sullen withdrawal toward Carentan, their artillery silenced, their infantry melting into the fields. For the first time that long day, I let myself breathe and take stock of what Easy Company had accomplished. I wandered back across the open pasture, no longer pinned down by machine guns or 105mm shells, and made a quiet promise to myself, someday, when all this madness was over, I'd come back to walk these fields again, in peace. Just as I made that vow, I felt a presence at my shoulder and turned. It was Lipton, with a faint grin, probably making the same silent promise. With the shooting ended, the family that owned Brecourt Manor finally emerged. Colonel de Vallevier was a gaunt old veteran of the Great War who had fought at the Marne and Verdun, survived wounds 3 separate times, and now, at 69, had lived to see his farm turned into a fortress. He had already lost 2 sons to the Germans in 1940. Now he appeared from the manor courtyard, accompanied by his wife and 2 remaining sons, Michael and Louis. They were ecstatic, embracing us with tears in their eyes. Michael, hands raised, walked forward alongside some Germans who'd stayed behind to surrender. In that terrible confusion, an American paratrooper, perhaps thinking Michel was a collaborator or simply another enemy, shot him in the back. We rushed Michel to the nearest aid station. He was given a blood transfusion on the beach, becoming the very first Frenchman evacuated back to England from Utah. Miraculously, he survived, and years later he didn't carry bitterness. Michel de Vallevielle became mayor of Sainte-Marie Dumont and founded the museum at Utah Beach. He spent the rest of his life honoring the memory of the men who had fought to free his home. On one of my many returns after the war, Louis and Michel walked me back out into that field and asked if I'd seen any civilians on D-Day. I told them no. They led me to a vast sinkhole in the earth, maybe 50 feet deep, choked with brush and young trees. During the fighting, they explained, one of their farm workers had taken his wife and 3 small children down into that hole and huddled there for 2 days straight as lead and steel cracked overhead. I could only imagine what that must have been like, trapped under a Normandy sky, alive with gunfire, praying the war would pass them by. Once Brecourt was secure, Easy Company received orders to move. We marched just a few miles south of Sainte-Marie-du-Mont, where General Maxwell Taylor had set up his command post. That night we bivouacked outside the tiny village of Culloville, which had become our battalion headquarters. After making sure our men were dug in and that we had outposts watching every approach, I went out alone on a night patrol. Part of me needed to collect my thoughts, to make sense of everything we'd lived through in just one day. As I eased up to a tree line, I heard the steady crunch of marching feet on a path, hobnailed boots, unmistakably German. I hit the ditch and lay flat, heart hammering as they passed within feet of me. A sour reek of tobacco drifted over, sharper and harsher than any American cigarette. I didn't smoke, but I'd never forget that smell. When they finally moved off, I gave silent thanks that the US Army issued us good boots with rubber soles. No telltale clatter like the enemy's iron-studded heels. And so ended D-Day. We'd landed, fought, won ground, and lived to see the next sunrise. Looking back, I knew our success hadn't come from luck alone, though fortune certainly played its part. It was the leadership at every level and the grueling training we'd endured that carried us through. We were so tight, so familiar with one another's strengths, that I'd instinctively place my very best, Compton, Guarner, Malarkey, in one strike force and Lipton and Ranney in the other. Those were Easy's killers. You learn who they are long before real combat. They're the ones who take to the craft of war without hesitation, who somehow function best under fire. Of course, many others wanted to prove themselves killers too. Some did over time. But the truth is, you only have a handful of men in any outfit who are truly wired for that savage work. The worst part is, your killers are always your first casualties, which is why you push to get them patched up and back to the line, so others can learn by their example before fate finally claims them. I never counted myself among them. I had killed, yes, and there were moments it brought a grim sense of satisfaction, knowing I'd accomplished the job with few losses on our side, but it never made me happy. I didn't hate the German soldiers we faced. I only wanted them gone, out of our way. Over the long march of the war, I'd come to respect the better German units, even if I still sought their destruction. That, though, was all in the future. For now, I was simply grateful to have survived my baptism of fire. That first night, even with German machine guns rattling off in the distance like drunken boys with fireworks, I finally stretched out. Before I closed my eyes, I knelt in the dirt and thanked God for sparing me and for letting me keep my men. Then I asked for just one more day. That's how I decided I'd live this war, one day at a time. If I made it through, I promised myself I'd find a little farm back in Pennsylvania, just a quiet corner of the world where I could finally trade rifles for plows and let the land heal me. There was no real pause after D-Day. We barely had a moment to gather ourselves. Around 0500, Easy Company was put on alert to continue the advance, though we initially stayed put in defensive positions outside Culloville, waiting for regimental orders. Our projected route would take us south through Vierville and Sainte, Combe-du-Mont, then across the Douve River and into Carentan itself. Just after dawn, Captain Hester, our battalion operations officer, came to find me. He didn't mince words. "Winters," he said, "I hate to do this to you after what you went through yesterday, but I want Easy Company to lead the column toward Vierville." He was speaking for Colonel Strayer, so there was nothing more to say. I simply nodded, gathered the men, and got ready to move. The march order placed us up front, Easy Company first, then battalion headquarters, followed by Dog and Fox companies. We trailed behind 1st Battalion initially, but before long they got pinned down by German fire between Beaumont and Angeville-au-Plain. What started there quickly flared into a full-on engagement. Over the next hours, our battalion destroyed 2 entire companies of enemy paratroopers. By the end of it, we'd taken about 140 prisoners and left roughly 150 Germans dead on the field. Most of them came from the 6th Parachute Regiment, apparently deployed to the area just 2 weeks before D-Day. Many of them were shockingly young, boys who should have been in school, and others were clearly too old for such hard soldiering. They didn't look like crack troops, but their gear was good and their ammunition plentiful. Interestingly, most of these prisoners were quite willing to talk, loose-lipped and frightened. That attitude, though, would harden considerably as we drove closer to Carentan. On June 7th, General Taylor himself came by our battalion headquarters to commend the men for their fighting. Meanwhile, Easy Company pressed on and secured Angeville, helped along by 2 light tanks that made short work of scattered German holdouts. After that, we were pulled back into reserve and given the job of guarding 506th Regimental headquarters. While we held there, word came through of the brutal fight Dog Company had run into near Saint-Côme-du-Mont. Captain Gerard Gross was killed instantly when an artillery shell detonated in a tree above him while he was talking to the battalion commander. Lieutenant Joe Macmillan took over Dog Company on the spot and would command them for the rest of the war. In my mind, he turned out to be the best company commander our battalion ever had. We also lost Lieutenant Colonel William Turner, the commanding officer of 1st Battalion. Turner had raised his head out of a tank turret just for a moment and was picked off by a sniper in plain sight of half the line. Normandy was proving itself a cruel teacher. One of the ugly constant problems we faced was what to do about all the bodies. The countryside was littered with the dead. German soldiers, their vehicles wrecked along hedgerows, horses and cattle stiff with death. Their legs pointed skyward in grotesque angles. Within days, under the June sun, they began to swell and split, the smell rolling for miles. Regiment brought in French civilians to burn and bury the livestock, but the stench was nearly unbearable. Our own work details buried German soldiers right where they fell, often in rough mass graves, while American dead were gathered by grave registration teams and temporarily interred in small battlefield cemeteries. Later, many of those boys would be reburied at the American cemetery atop the bluffs overlooking Omaha Beach. Normandy itself, with its lush fields and dairy pastures, suffered terribly. The Calvados and La Manche regions had long been prized for their green meadows and steady rain. The area was famous for milk, cream, cheeses like Camembert and Livarot, and endless rows of apple trees for cider, but the fighting turned that upside down. Shells churned fields to mud. Livestock went unmilked or starved. Orchards burned. In those first weeks of June, Normandy's dairy trade all but collapsed. In time, once the armies rolled inland, the land began to heal. Today, it's again among the richest farming regions in France. And then there was the temptation of Norman brandy. Calvados, an apple brandy, often served to clear the palate between courses, was everywhere, along with cognac. Trouble was, if it hadn't been aged 10 or 15 years, it could take the skin clean off your throat. Allied soldiers discovered that quickly. Lieutenant Harry Welsh found an entire barrel of cognac in one village and seemed determined to finish it by himself. More than once I caught Harry flat drunk, once lying sprawled right across a road on his reserve parachute, fully exposed to any German with a rifle. The enemy started zeroing in, forcing me to drag him off the road by his collar. There were times I'd talk to Harry and only later realize he hadn't heard a word I said. It took a few days, but we got that problem under control. Sleep was scarce. Even on quiet nights, the mind ran wild. Anticipating the next fight, replaying the last one, it kept a man awake. Worse were the mosquitoes. Before the invasion, the Germans had deliberately flooded large parts of Normandy to slow any Allied airborne landings. All it did was create miles of stagnant pools, perfect for breeding mosquitoes by the million. In the evenings, you could see pillars of them rising hundreds of feet. Our men had no mosquito nets. You'd lie there, slapping your neck and ears, half crazed by the buzzing. The climate offered no mercy either. June days were long. Night lasted maybe 6 or 7 hours before dawn returned. Normandy drizzled constantly, never quite dry. Nights could turn bitter cold, and by habit we wore extra layers. The weather shifted like the tides along the coast. A dry day was a rarity. Letters home bore vague addresses like cold and wet in Normandy. Censorship wouldn't allow anything more specific. Then there were the needless alarms. Once, Battalion HQ passed word that we might expect a German gas attack. We hurried to prep masks and stand by, but it never came. About the same time, the Luftwaffe finally showed up, swooping in to strafe our positions around Carentan. After everything, though, those days still felt almost restful. We needed it. Since June 5th, when we'd first heard the words, "We go tonight," none of us had gotten proper sleep. The jump, the fights at Brecourt, Angoville, the constant pushing south, most of us had grabbed less than 6 hours total in 4 days. It couldn't last. By June 10th, elements of the 29th Division, fresh from Omaha Beach, linked up with us northeast of Carentan. That town of about 4,000 sat astride the main road to Cherbourg. Taking Carentan was critical. General Taylor devised a 3-pronged attack. The 327th Glider Infantry would hit from the north, the 501st from the northeast, while our regiment, Sink's 506th, would swing wide around to the southwest under cover of darkness. H hour was set for dawn on June 12th. We had to make a night march to reach our assault line. Night moves always carried risk, hard enough in training, let alone in hedgerow country under the threat of ambush. But if there was one thing Easy Company excelled at, it was moving by night. For all Captain Sobel's faults, he drilled us relentlessly on night patrols and forced marches. We'd crossed forests and creeks, sorted compass problems, and stumbled through every pitfall. We'd actually learned to see better in the dark. By Normandy, our men were entirely at ease stepping off into the gloom. The same couldn't be said of regimental or divisional staff officers. They'd often skipped those field problems, and now, on D-Day Plus, their lack of experience showed. Many struggled to orient themselves or locate objectives, and the Norman hedgerows only made it worse. Meanwhile, our NCOs and troopers found their way almost by instinct. On the evening of June 11th, we began moving out across the marshes toward Carentan. Our route took us over a small bridge, then west through swampy fields and tangled hedgerows to a set of railroad tracks. The ground was a nightmare, wet, uneven, each step a gamble. The battalion kept losing contact with its own companies. Every time we broke physical contact, the men in the rear would start shouting or clattering to catch up, ruining noise discipline. It usually happened because the lead elements pushed through a rough patch and then picked up the pace, not realizing how badly it strung out the rest. Regimental HQ only added to the confusion by constantly shifting boundaries between 1st and 2nd battalions. It was a miserable night. We'd move, stop, dig in, set up machine guns and bazookas, then move again, over and over. Finally, around 200 on June 12th, we crossed the Douve River right in front of Carentan. By 05:30 that morning, our battalion had finally sorted itself into formation. Easy Company found its assigned road with Fox on our left and Battalion HQ trailing behind. Dog Company stood in reserve. Colonel Strayer planned to attack with 2 companies abreast, sweeping down the southwest approach into Carentan. What we didn't fully realize then was how perfectly positioned we were to choke off the German retreat. As the rest of the division pushed from the north and northeast, our job was to cut the main road leading south. If we could hold that intersection, the enemy would be forced to flee through the swamps or be slaughtered outright. It was, looking back, one of General Taylor's smartest tactical moves. We were tired, filthy, itchy with bites, and soaked to the skin, but as the first light of June 12th crept over Normandy, Easy Company got ready to finish what we'd started on D-Day, by hammering Carentan and sealing the fate of the Germans, who still clung to the Cotentin. With respect to how I put Easy Company into the attack, I deployed 1st Platoon on the left side of the road, 2nd Platoon on the right, and kept 3rd Platoon to the rear. The road we were to move down toward that critical T-intersection sloped gently downhill, shallow ditches on either side, open enough to give a clear view but also dangerously exposed. It was calm at first, eerily so. Then, as we waited, Lieutenant George Lavenson, our Battalion S1, decided he needed to relieve himself. He wandered off the road into the field between E Company and F Company. As I moved forward, I caught a glimpse of the pale flash of his rear end. Just then, a single shot cracked out across the field, echoing in the quiet, and Lavenson pitched forward, shot right through the backside. He was evacuated to England and then on to the States to recover, but fate wasn't done with him. The transport plane carrying him home went down. George had been a good officer, an old E Company man. Losing him stung. As we got into position, I spread men along both sides of the road, readying ourselves to seize the intersection. Lieutenant Harry Welsh led 1st Platoon at the very front. Right on schedule, I gave him the shout, "Move out!" But the instant we started forward, the Germans struck. A machine gun hidden in a building at the base of the hill opened up, spraying the road. It was a perfect ambush, straight down our line of advance. Welsh immediately pushed 6 men toward the intersection anyway, charging directly at that machine gun position. But the fire was devastating. The rest of our men on both sides of the road dropped low into the ditches and then froze, leaving Welsh and his handful alone under that torrent of bullets. From back down the line, I heard Colonel Strayer and his staff, Hester and Nixon among them, yelling up at me, "Get them moving, Winters! Get them moving!" I dropped to the ground, shrugging out of excess gear so I could run light. Standing up, I shouted, "Move out! Move out!" But heads just pressed deeper into the grass. That was the only time in the entire war I truly lost my temper. I charged out of the ditch with nothing but my M1, roaring at the top of my lungs. I sprinted up to the front, darted across the road, then back again, literally kicking men in the rear, screaming, "Get going!" I'll never forget the shock on their faces, wide-eyed, half in fear, half in disbelief. Meanwhile, that German machine gun found me instantly. Bullets cracked past my ears, smacked into the road, chipped stone at my feet. For a moment it felt like I was charmed, like some unseen hand was sparing me. But that illusion didn't last. A few minutes later, I'd learned just how mortal I really was. Finally, the men surged forward again. As Sergeant Talbot jogged past, he called out, "Which way?" when we hit the intersection. "Turn right," I hollered back. With that, we pushed on. House by house, we cleared the intersection, grenades exploding ahead, as Welsh and his men finally stormed the machine gun nest, killing the crew outright. The Germans began pulling back, retreating south, but they had a nasty surprise waiting. Knowing right where we'd bunch up, they slammed the intersection with prearranged mortar and machine gun fire. It was vicious. Men dropped all around. A fragment caught me too, a sharp bite through the tongue of my boot into my leg. Once the worst of it subsided, I quickly organized a defensive line, checked ammo and redistributed what we had left, preparing for the counterattack we were sure would come. I made my way to the aid station in a courtyard 20 yards behind us to see to our wounded, and let the medic dig the fragment out of my leg. He worked quickly, tweezers, sulfur, a bandage, and I left my boot unlaced to give it some room. Then I went back to work. We'd taken the intersection, but at a cost. Easy Company had 10 casualties. Among the wounded were Lipton, Ed Tipper, and Burr Smith. In the aid station, I spotted Private Albert Blythe sitting against a wall. I couldn't see any wounds, so I asked, "How are you doing, Blythe?" His eyes darted around, wide and frightened. I can't see," he said. I crouched beside him, tried to keep my voice steady. "It's okay, Blythe, relax. They'll have you out of here and back to England soon enough." As I stood to move on, Blythe suddenly pushed himself up. "I'm okay. I can see now," he blurted. Just like that, the fog of fear seemed to clear. And instead of taking the easy way out with an evacuation, Blythe picked up his rifle and went right back to the line. Think about that. Terrified blind with fear one moment, then back with his buddies the next. Later, he'd be wounded again. After the war, he served with distinction in Korea, earning the Silver Star and Bronze Star, eventually retiring as a first sergeant. Sometimes all a man needed was a calm word and a hand on the shoulder to steady him. Though we braced for a counterattack that didn't immediately come, I couldn't have been prouder of what Easy Company had done that day. Later, talking over the fight with Major Hester, he told me plainly that he'd seen another company in a near-identical spot freeze under machine gun fire and get cut to pieces. Easy Company had surged forward, done its job, and refused to be stopped. A letter from Sergeant Talbot years after the war humbled me more than anything Hester ever said. Seeing you in the middle of that road, wanting to move, was too much. You were my total inspiration, he wrote. All my boys felt the same. Tab was far too generous. He himself had hauled Lipton to safety under fire, directed men everywhere during the final counterattack, and was wounded before being evacuated. When the regiment pulled together again, we began pressing south after the retreating Germans. For the first 2 miles there was almost no resistance. Then we ran headlong into a formidable German line on the high ground west of Carentan. They had excellent fields of fire, heavy hedgerows, and machine guns perfectly sighted. The 506th took the right-hand side of the road, with 2nd Battalion on the outer flank. Easy Company anchored the far right by the railroad tracks, running along the flooded fields. It turned into a mess of confusion, nearly as bad as Bastogne would later become. At one point, I discovered Easy Company men firing at another battalion's troops by mistake. Later, tanks showed up to support us, but started blasting into our own lines. By nightfall, we finally got it sorted. Food, water, and ammo arrived just in time. That night was chaos. The Germans, retreating or repositioning, hollered to one another across the fields and fired off bursts from their burp guns. Close to midnight, a German patrol slipped across the open ground and fired wildly, sending my heart leaping into my throat. I half expected a full assault to follow. On one outpost, Sergeant Floyd Talbot tapped Private G.H. Smith gently on the helmet with his pistol to wake him. Smith bolted up, confused and terrified, and drove his bayonet into Talbot. Tab would later joke about it, saying, "I could have shot that bastard 6 times as he lunged at me, but I didn't think we could spare a man." It was one of those grim battlefield moments that somehow became a darkly funny story when we made it back to England. At roughly 05:30 the next morning, everything erupted. Artillery, mortars, machine guns, rifles. It was like both armies decided to unload every last round. Under that withering fire, one of our sister companies broke and ran, pulling back without any orders from Battalion HQ. That exposed Easy's entire left flank. Dog Company, seeing their flank dangling, also pulled back. Suddenly, Easy Company was alone, strung out along the front line. The flooded marsh anchoring our right and absolutely nothing on our left. We stayed. A German tank tried to force its way through the hedgerow on our left, right where Fox Company had been. Lieutenant Welsh and his bazooka man, Private John McGrath, didn't hesitate. They dashed straight out into the open. As the tank's underbelly lifted, crossing the hedgerow, they fired a rocket that blew it apart. Meanwhile, battalion cobbled F&D companies back together and pushed them forward by about 150 yards, partially closing the gap, but still leaving us exposed. By mid-afternoon, salvation rolled up in the form of the 2nd Armoured Division, 60 tanks and ranks of fresh infantry. I can't describe the relief watching those Shermans rumble past. 50 cals hammering into the hedgerows, infantry beside them like it was a field manoeuvre back in the States. The Germans didn't stand a chance against that kind of steel. Looking back, the 2nd Battalion of the 506th fought many hard battles in the war, but none more vicious than holding that line outside Carentan on June 13th, 1944. That day, we were nearly overrun. I remembered a letter from a friend in the States who once told me, "If you're ever in a tight spot, remember you must come back." Well, June 13th was the tightest spot we ever faced. The fact that Easy Company stood firm when others broke. It wasn't about my leadership or anyone else's. It was the spirit of the American paratrooper, the stubborn refusal to let go of the ground we'd bled for. Now that we were finally relieved, Easy Company fell back into Carentan. As our column marched up the gentle rise toward the main road leading into town, we were still well within range of German machine guns. I was just behind Corporal Bull Randleman when, out of nowhere, we heard the unmistakable chattering burst of an MG-42. Bullets slapped the road in front of us, skipping off the hard surface with a terrible hiss. Bull gave a sudden yell. "Damn! I'm hit!" Then stumbled out of line, clawing at his harness and tearing off his musette bag. He dropped to his knees, half convinced he was mortally wounded. When he felt moisture running down his back, he braced for the worst. Sure, it was blood. But it turned out a spent round had punched through his musette bag, rupturing his spare canteen. Water trickled out, not blood. It was a stroke of luck, because Easy could scarcely afford to lose another good man, and Bull was as solid as they came. That night I slept in a hotel bed for the first time since England, between clean sheets no less, while the men were billeted in houses across the town. My leg had grown stiff and tender from the shrapnel wound. The medics cleaned it again, kept me on sulfur tablets, and ordered me to take it easy for a few days. Harry Welsh stepped up to lead the company while I recovered, proving himself once more as dependable as they came. On June 20th, Easy Company moved back up to the main line south of Carentan. For the next 8 days, we held that front, sending out patrols every evening, listening to the Germans do the same. It was a dangerous routine. On one daylight patrol, led by Guarnere, Blythe was out front as point man when he spotted a German sniper perched in a tree. Reflexes from training kicked in. He blurted out, "Bang! Bang!" instead of dropping into the ditch and firing. The sniper didn't hesitate. He squeezed off a shot that caught Blythe right through the collarbone. Guarnere's patrol hauled him back to our lines, shaken but alive. A week of this slow, tense patrolling passed before Easy was finally rotated off the line and placed in reserve on June 28th. By the next day, we shifted near Cherbourg. General Taylor himself came to see us there. He spoke plainly, told us how proud he was that Easy Company had held firm outside Carentan. We were grateful for his words, but honestly, the men were far more thankful simply not to be under direct fire anymore. The lull let us take stock, not just of the fight, but of ourselves. 3 straight weeks of combat had gutted Easy. We'd lost 10 men on June 12th at Carentan, another 9 the very next day in the savage defence against the counter-attack. In total, we'd suffered 65 casualties, nearly half the company gone. By June 30th, Easy was down to just 74 officers and men fit for duty. Normandy had been a brutal reckoning. Being out of the line also gave us time to look around and really see France. As the Germans retreated, the French locals grew bolder. It couldn't have been easy for them. Everyone in Normandy lost something to our invasion. But still, they hung flags from windows, waved at our columns, flashed thumbs-ups or the V for victory sign. The hatred they felt for the occupiers seemed to bind them to us. Out in the countryside, though, we didn't sense they had suffered as badly as the cities. Places like Caen and Cherbourg had seen harsh Nazi crackdowns, summary executions of anyone even suspected of aiding the resistance. But the dairy farms of Normandy still thrived. Milk, cheese, butter, even fresh eggs weren't hard to come by. Bread was about the only thing truly rationed. We had visitors too. Colonel Sink arrived one afternoon, brimming with pride. Alongside him was Colonel Joseph Harper of the 327th Glider Infantry. Sink wanted me to tell the story, how we'd knocked out the guns at Brecourt. I gave it to them straight. We laid down a base of fire, manoeuvred on the guns, took them out one by one. Nothing fancy, just hard soldiering. Not all visitors were welcome. SLA Marshall, the famous combat historian from Supreme Allied Headquarters, showed up soon after to conduct his after-action interviews. He was eager to publish statistics claiming fewer than 20% of soldiers ever actually fired their weapons in combat. I could have told him outright that didn't apply to Easy Company. Our boys were decisively engaged from the moment their boots hit French soil. Marshall seemed more interested in West Point graduates than frontline men. When he dragged me into a tent crammed with senior officers to recount our actions on D-Day, I kept it brief, told him the same as I'd told Sink. Base of fire, maneuver, take the guns. The meeting meant nothing to me. I wanted out of there fast. In the end, Marshall's write-up twisted everything, suggesting Streyer's battalion merely entertained the Germans from afar, while I supposedly ran to Utah Beach and borrowed tanks. It was complete nonsense. He wasn't even close to the truth. None of that took away from what Easy Company accomplished. At Brecourt, just a fraction of us took out that battery, surely saving hundreds on Utah Beach. Carentan, though, was our first real fight as a complete company. We spearheaded the attack into town and held fast when other units buckled. Even when that massive counterattack came crashing down on us, catching us half dug in and disorganized, our training held. The men stuck to their rifles, stuck to each other. By the end of Carentan, Easy was a battle-hardened unit. I didn't fool myself into thinking that made us invincible. One campaign doesn't guarantee anything, but we'd gained a quiet, steely confidence. Personally, my self-assurance grew right alongside theirs. More than once, men grabbed my arm and said, "God, I'm glad to see you." In that thin line under relentless fire, sometimes just showing up, asking how they were, reminding them to lift their heads and shoot back, that mattered. Success breeds confidence, and our success in Normandy bred the iron belief that we could survive whatever came next. Still, I couldn't help thinking if I'd trained them even harder, done my job just a bit better, maybe more of my boys would have gone home. On July 1st, the army promoted me to captain. It felt hollow compared to the simple pleasure of finally taking a warm shower. A day later, General Omar Bradley pinned the Distinguished Service Cross on me. Then, on July 10th, we moved down to Utah Beach to embark for England. Standing there, seeing that vast forest of ships stretching beyond the horizon, the American flag snapping in the wind, I nearly went weak in the knees. Tears fill my eyes. That memory has never left me. To this day, whenever I hear people argue over the right to burn the flag, I see that beach again, and the emotion rises up all over. That night we camped by the dunes, and on July 11th we boarded an LST. By evening on the 12th, we were back in Southampton. A train carried us to Aldbourne by noon the next day. The sight of friendly English faces, the warm greetings, it felt like coming home. Piles of backlogged mail waited for us. New uniforms and weapons were handed out, our old ones left behind in France. On July 14th, I stood before Easy Company and gave them a quick talk. Keep your heads on straight, don't get into trouble on leave. 15 minutes later, the camp was empty. They were off on a week's furlough, eager to forget the war for a while. I stayed behind, legs still stiff, visiting my English family, the Barneses, who embraced me like a returned son. Mrs. Barnes had heard the stories on the BBC. When she hugged me, she whispered, "I'm so proud of you. I just knew you would do good." England took some getting used to. Church bells woke me in the night, startling me. The last time I'd heard bells was on D-Day in that dark Normandy morning before we jumped. Back then, I'd crouched alone, clutching only a knife, feeling hunted. Machine gun fire never truly scared me, but church bells did. They brought ghosts. Like most of the men, I eventually drifted to London. There, I learned firsthand what it meant to be on the receiving end of Hitler's new V1 rockets. In Normandy, we'd seen them from a distance, like stars travelling the wrong way. In London, the advice was clear. If you heard the motor, you were safe. Once it cut out, you ran. But after all we'd been through, dead tired, lying 3 stories up in a Red Cross bunk, I figured running could wait. Back in Aldbourne, I spent quiet days writing letters to the families of our dead and wounded, a painful duty I would never get used to. I also directed the men to smuggle back all the .30 caliber ammunition they could from Normandy. I wanted it for live fire exercises. I planned to put replacements through the same hell we'd just survived, under real bullets. It was risky, one stray round, and it'd be my head. But it worked. When we went to Holland and Bastogne, Easy Company moved under fire like seasoned veterans. To keep my own demons at bay, I pushed my body harder than ever. I ran 2 or 3 miles almost daily, knocked out 80 push-ups, 60 sit-ups on a footlocker, did splits and stretches. It kept me sharp, helped me unwind. Sundays, I polished my boots and buttons, arranged my ribbons, and went to church. It was a privilege I wouldn't miss. Combat had stripped away what mattered from what didn't. Before D-Day, I used to thank God for 100 small things. Now, my prayers were simpler. Just let me be alive tomorrow. Everything else was extra, unnecessary burdens in a world where survival was the only prize worth having.